Good evening and welcome. I'm Anne Kerry, the President of the Australian Council of TESOL Associations and a member of Vic TESOL. Welcome to this first event of the Vic TESOL Early Childhood Education Series for 2022. This event is being conducted in conjunction with ACTA, the Australian Council of TESOL Associations. Please see link for where you can access presentations and resources for the 2021 Vic TESOL Early Childhood Education Series. It's in the chat box. We would like to thank the Collier Foundation for supporting the 2022 Vic TESOL Early Childhood Education Series. We'll begin the evening with acknowledgement of country. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we meet on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend this acknowledgement to the lands on which you join us from today. I would also like to acknowledge the rich lessons that we as educators can learn from Aboriginal peoples who have created and maintained links through language that have lasted for tens of thousands of years. This session will be recorded and made available on the website to members of Vic TESOL and those who have joined us this evening. If you have any questions, please place them in the chat Q&A function. They will be responded to by the presenters at the end of the evening. If you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat function to talk to Vic TESOL staff or email victesol@victesol.vic.edu.au. Around 25% of the population of Australia speak a language other than English at home. In this special edition of TESOL in Context, we ask critical questions about the role of language and identity in nurturing children's holistic development in educational settings and in early childhood contexts. A wide range of work is underway into pedagogical and policy practices that view multilingualism, including home languages, English as an additional language, and additional languages as a lived and dynamic experience. A child's range of linguistic and cultural resources play a valuable role in the experience of belonging, being and becoming. This TESOL in Context Special Early Childhood Education Edition focuses on a selection of work being conducted both in the Australian context and internationally into this growing field of inquiry. This evening, there will be 3 presentations based on 3 of the 4 papers from this special edition. Unfortunately, the authors of the 4th paper in this special edition cannot be with us this evening. However, we'd like to share a little bit about their work. From Canada, Professor Shelley Stagg Peterson, Yvette Manitowabi, Jacinta Manitowabi, in their paper, write about the Niichii Project, Revitalizing Indigenous Language in Northern Canada. Edith and Jacinta are kindergarten teachers who discuss 4 principles of Indigenous pedagogies in this project with Shelley Stagg Peterson, a university researcher. They create a context for the children to engage in activities, to learn their traditional language and culture, creating positive identities. A rabbit puppet named Niichii, who is a friend, is central to the project. Yvette and Jacinta in the paper describe and interpret the learning activities according to 4 elements of Indigenous pedagogies: intergenerational learning, experiential learning, spiritual learning involving interconnections with the land and learning about relationality. The project builds on the children's bunds of knowledge for grounding their cultural connections to the local community. We would really encourage you to read this paper in this special edition. And you can also view Professor Shelley Stagg Peterson, Jacinta and Yvette's 2021 Big TESOL Early Childhood Education Series presentation about this project at the link in the chat box. Now we will have the first presentation of the evening. The paper is entitled Levering Languages for Learning, Incorporating Plurilingual Pedagogies in Early Childhood Education and Care. I'd like to welcome Associate Professor Caroline Cohrssen, Dr. Yvette Slaughter, and Dr. Edith Nicolas.
Thanks so much, Anne. Thank you. Thanks for your kind introduction. And before I say a few words about the paper on behalf of myself and my co-authors, I'd first of all like to express my thanks to the editors for inviting us to contribute a paper and congratulate TESOL and Context on this fantastic special issue. It's wonderful, and I'm convinced that people are going to find it very helpful and influential in their thinking. I'd also like to say that writing this paper together has been an absolute joy for us. My co-authors, Yvette, Edith, and I have all spent a lot of time working in environments where we were the different ones, and we have a personal experience of what that feels like. We all feel very strongly about this paper, and we were just delighted that it's been published. So I'm going to set the scene for the article a little bit first before I actually move into some of the detail. And I'm going to paint the story of the article in pretty broad brushstrokes, because you'll find it more detailed when you read it through yourselves. But if you were a parent whose child was learning to speak English as an additional language, I'm sure you'd feel much more confident if you knew that your child was in the care of educators who valued your child's language skills in their home language as well as in English, and helped or tried to help your child to develop relationships and learn through play using all the communication skills that they already have. So in other words, the educators who were caring for your child and supporting your child valued what your child could do already. So census data tells us that in 2016, my figures say 21%, but I think Anne's figures are more up to date than mine are perhaps. 21 or say 25% of Australians are speaking a language other than English at home. That's a big number. That's, you know, how many? 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 of us are speaking a language other than English at home. And in 2022, Australia is one of the top countries in the world where the most languages are spoken. So I think we're in the top 10 of the countries across the whole world where the most languages are spoken. And this isn't going to surprise early childhood educators, I'm sure, because I mean, first of all, many of us speak more than one language ourselves. But second, because we're familiar with the cultural and linguistic diversity of the children attending our early learning centres and their families, this doesn't really come as a surprise to us. So why is it important? This is where we're starting to move now into the content of the paper that we've published. Because the language that children speak have important implications for their belonging, being, and becoming. It's that simple. So remember as well that the idea of encouraging children's use of more than one language is in fact nothing new. We're not saying anything that you won't be familiar with already. It was embedded 13 years ago in the current version of the Early Years Learning Framework. And in the paper, in the special issues, you'll see how we unpack examples of multiple times in which it occurs in the EYLF. We highlight this for you to look at and reflect on. But in fact, more and more research, more and more recent research is suggesting that as education professionals, we need to change the way that we think about language learning. Languages aren't stored in separate silos with each language in its own silo. Instead, we need to be thinking about children having a toolkit with all the language capabilities that they have inside that toolkit so that they can draw from those language capabilities as they need to at any particular time. And this is also important because when educators encourage children's ability to draw on more than one language from their linguistic toolkit, they take a strength-based approach to this linguistic diversity. So our shift then happens from seeing an English language learner as lacking English language skills to actually recognizing that they have a heap of language skills, of which their emerging English language skills is just one. And so obviously this supports the language learning of children who are using English as an additional language, but it also supports the language learning of other children around them. So there are multiple reasons why this is important. Our paper is called Leveraging Languages for Learning, Incorporating Plurilingual Pedagogies in Early Childhood Education and Care. Now that's a bit of a wordy title. So what I'm going to do for the remainder of our 10 minutes or so is explain what we talk about just briefly in the next few minutes. So in the paper, what we do is discuss the things that influence the ways in which early childhood educators approach the use of languages for learning. I'm going to highlight just 3 of them, and then we thought we would leave you with 2 points to reflect on after the end of our session. So the first one that we're going to talk about, or what I'm going to explain to you is that we address in the paper is called language ideology. And this term language ideology describes the beliefs and attitudes that shape and are shaped by socio-contextual factors. So English proficiency, for example, is important in our education systems and in the employment sector. We know that, that's a fact. This is a social contextual factor. It shapes our attitudes and our beliefs about language learning. But remember, the research is showing that English language learners draw on all of their language knowledge when they're learning English. And so it's important then that early childhood educators encourage children and their families to maintain their first languages while their English language skills are growing. And why? Because they're all part of the same toolkit. So that was language ideology, the first influence that we talk about in our paper. The second one that we talk is educators' belief systems. And this is obviously something that's quite personal to each of us as an educator. But research tells us that many educators, and especially those who already speak more than one language themselves, encourage linguistic diversity. They encourage this language diversity within their children and the use of languages in their programs. At the same time, though, we suggest in our paper that an educator's unconscious behaviors or assumptions may reflect negative beliefs and attitudes towards culturally and linguistically diverse children and their families. So unconscious behaviors are a bit tricky for the simple fact that they are unconscious. And we suggest that these unconscious behaviors may emerge as what we describe there as micro invalidations. And even though these behaviors are unintentional, they would obviously send negative messages to children and their families that may impact on their belonging, being, and becoming. The third point that we touch on in our paper is actually influenced by the first 2. And this is about educators' own teaching practice in the context of the diversity of languages that are used in a culturally and linguistically diverse society. Excuse me. And this is the plurilingual pedagogies that we refer to in the title of our paper. So pluri meaning many, right? So what does plurilingual pedagogies then mean? It means that as educators, we acknowledge that children draw on more than one language for learning. This we've talked about. And that we actively encourage them to do this. So that takes it a step further. In this way, in doing this, we demonstrate to children and their families that all languages are valued. This in turn enhances the identity, sense of community, well-being, learning and communication of children who are learning English as an additional language. And you're going to recognize those as the learning outcomes from the EYLF. But importantly, it also enhances the identity, sense of community, well-being, learning, communication of all children. Assoc data show us that in early childhood education, we already have strong, respectful relationships with families. This means that as educators, we don't need to speak every language that's spoken by the children in a group. Why? Because we've got experts to partner with. We already have strong relationships with them, and these are children's families. So we're basically really well positioned to be leveraging languages for learning, to be enacting plurilingual pedagogies in our practice in our early childhood settings. And so at this point, Yvette, Edith and I would like to leave you with 2 points to reflect on. To what extent are we purposefully leveraging languages to support the active participation of all children in learning as one aspect of our intentional teaching? So intentional teaching, this needs to form part of our intentional teaching in the classroom. And could we perhaps do this a bit better? And the second point we thought we would leave with you to reflect on is, on the other hand, is it possible that we unintentionally give the impression that children who look or sound different from us are maybe not really Australian? Or perhaps we say something to families like, oh, you know, we're all friends here, your child will be fine, without actually recognizing that it's much trickier to negotiate the world in a second or third language. So we really hope that the article leads to some interesting conversations amongst you and with your teams. And like you, I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other authors of papers in this wonderful special issue that's focusing on languages in early childhood education. And thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Caroline, on behalf of the team of researchers. And I think you've left us with some food for thought with those questions. And I think it leads nicely into the second paper, Mothers as First Teachers, Exploring the Features of Mother-Child Interactions that Support Young Aboriginal Children's Multilingual Learning at Playgroup. Associate Professor Janet Scull and Associate Professor Jane Page will present on behalf of the project team. Thanks, Jane and Janet.
Thank you so much, Anne, and good evening, everyone. My name is Jane Page and I'm here this evening with Janet, and we're just delighted to be a part of the special TESOL in Context edition, Languages in Early Childhood Education, launched to discuss our article, which we co-authored with our colleagues and co-researchers Wanyee Lee, Lisa Murray, Dorothy Gapani, Samantha Stewart, Marilyn Murican, Nuala Scannell, Rona Lawrence, Jonica Jurakai, Felicity Hayes, Verity Burawanga, Leah Chenoweth, Michelle Callahan, Jessica Noella-Govius, Megan Cock, Susan Menther, Patricia Eadie and Joseph Sparling. As we begin our presentation this evening, we would also like to express our gratitude and thanks to the mothers, children, families and community members and our Families as First Teacher Playgroup co-researchers who played such a critical role in contributing their cultural knowledges and wisdom throughout the implementation of our study. And to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging who have been and are the traditional custodians of the lands on which the research took place. We'd also like to extend our gratitude and thanks to our colleagues and research partners in the Department of Education, Northern Territory Government, who played a critical role in the implementation of the research, and to the members of the Department's Indigenous Early Childhood Parenting Reference Group for their guidance and contributions throughout the research. I'm going to share with you some of the background to our research, and then Janet will speak to the specifics, as well as the features of mother-child interactions that support young Aboriginal children's multilingual learning at playgroups where the research took place. So, to provide some context, the research which we are sharing this evening was nested in a larger 3-year Australian Research Council linkage project entitled Building a Bridge into Preschool in Remote Indigenous Communities. And this research evaluated the impact of the Abecedarian Approach Australia, which we'll refer to as 3A, teaching and learning strategies at 2 Families as First Teacher playgroups in remote Northern Territory communities. And we specifically evaluated the impact of these strategies on young Aboriginal children's learning and overall development prior to attending school and preschool. But the project also really importantly explored the aspirations of families and community members for their children's learning and education. And this aspect of the research included reflecting on whether first languages and cultural knowledge is aligned with the 3A teaching and learning activities at the FAF playgroups, and whether and how they could be embedded into daily 3A learning experiences to support young Aboriginal children's languages, learning and cultural knowledges and skills prior to attending preschool. Underpinning this research was the recognition and appreciation of Indigenous peoples' right to use and develop their languages over generations, as outlined in Article 13 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Key principles and priorities for multiple language also were used to further guide the design and development of the study. And these priorities included, for example, the maintenance of a child's first home language or languages as an essential part of developing a child's sense of identity and promoting language and cognition, as well as the ongoing development of children's first languages and progress in learning English as an additional language as a foundation or prerequisite to bilingual children achieving the 5 learning outcomes outlined in the National Early Years Learning Framework, which both Anne and Caroline have referred to. Importantly, these priorities also align with the broader intent of the families as first teachers, or what I'll refer to as FAFT playgroups, in which the research took place. FAFT playgroups were rolled out in the Northern Territory from 2009 with the dual aims to build the confidence of Aboriginal parents as their children's first teachers and to improve developmental outcomes for young Aboriginal children through access to and engagement in high-quality, evidence-informed educational programs. To achieve these aims, FAFT playgroups are importantly led by a family liaison officer, a local Aboriginal person with expertise and experience in early childhood education, and a family educator and an accredited early childhood teacher who work together in local implementation teams to ensure cultural competence in the delivery of the evidence-based 3A educational program. In the context of our study, daily FAF playgroup sessions were held on 5 mornings per week in Community 1 and 4 mornings per week in Community 2, which increased to 5 mornings per week in the last 12 months of the study. To give you a sense of the communities, approximately 3,000 people live in Community 1 and speak a range of English languages, including Standard Australian English and Aboriginal English, and 13 different local languages. And there are approximately 2,500 people who live in Community 2 who primarily speak various English languages and Yolngu Matha in their daily interactions. Overall, in our broader study, 149 children and families engaged in the research, but in the study that we're referring to tonight, 20 mothers and children participated, and this study specifically explored how mothers supported children's language learning in free play and book reading experiences. So I'm going to hand over to Janet now, who'll explain this research to you in more detail and share the features of mother-child interactions that supported their children's multilingual learning. Thank you, Janet.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane. And it's always interesting to hear of the complexity of language, you know, the complexity of language repertoires of young children. I think Caroline articulated that in her discussion of her paper, and Jane again has indicated that these children grow up in very rich language environments, and we need to celebrate and applaud those opportunities that the children are provided with. Now, I'm going to ask Claire to just share some slides as I work through some of the details or the results of this study in terms of how mothers did support these very young children in their earliest language learning. So as Jane articulated, we had 20 mother-child dyads in this sub-study, And then we had 15 matched free play and book reading videos that we were able to use for analysis. And you can see here that we are talking about very young children. So this is a study of children aged 8 to 16 months from the first site and 12 to 15 months at the second site. Jane talked about the Abbotserian approaches with book reading and play. And we were studying the free play, as we said, and the book reading interactions with the simple instruction given to the mothers that we're just looking at how mums and children play and read books together. And here are some toys and books that you may use. We'll leave the camera on for about 10 minutes and we'll just sit here quietly while you play and read with your child. And importantly, the aim and the opportunity is to enjoy this special time alone with your child. So they were the sort of the outline that we gave to the parents around this study. We then filmed the interactions. We used Studio Code as an analysis tool to sort of highlight different interactions, different the languages used as they occurred. And then we identified probably what we would refer to as high incidence segments within the videos for closer analysis around particularly what we were looking at is how the children were learning languages for later learning in the FAFT play groups. So Claire, if we could just look at the next slide. Okay, thank you. So what we found most importantly, that the mothers had a rich language repertoire. And as well as this rich language repertoire, were making quite deliberate language choices as they communicated with their children. And in this way, of course, demonstrating their own language dexterity. These language repertoires were used and evident in each of the play and the book reading interactions that we were able to capture within the FAFT play group. So I want to share with you some examples of what we captured in terms of the mother's language use. And in the first instance, we saw the participants code switching. Now, code switching is often referred to, we looked at both intersentinel code switching and across code switching examples within the interactions, but at the whole time or across all of these, the code switching, name languages used at their discretion, while of course maintaining the meaningful speech interactions with their young children. So you could see here we have Indigenous language used for the word crocodile, immediately switching into big one for in English. And then we have awa, which is a word commonly used in Site 1 to express delight with their children. And then again, moving into some more English language use. Similarly, in the second, we have Indigenous language followed by, in a larger sort of, I guess, what you might call stream of language around those three different lexical items, and then moving into English again to express delight once again with hooray and right. So the mothers very carefully and quite deliberately selecting the language or using the language, their language in and choices in ways to support the children's own language learning. Code switching was evident alongside the use, if we just move to the next slide now, thanks Claire, yes, the use of translation. So this is where you would see the parents facilitating children's vocabulary learning of multiple language. So first in a local language and then the same concept referred to in English. So the children were hearing both languages to express the same concept side by side to support their language use. And alongside the use of translation, we also had And most interestingly, in these two sites, so these two communities that we were involved in, using sign language and gesture to communicate with their young children and scaffolding their language. And as many of you would know, gesture is a particularly important way of communication in some of these communities. So in the first example here, you have the mother using language, yellow ware, as they were playing with some coloured blocks, both blue, yellow and red, but then also using this very specific gesture for wear to help the child engage in this interaction with her. And in the second example here, you can see we've got the baby, we've got language for sleeping, we've got the child's name, and then we've got this notion of gesture, which would be quite common with very young children. As we say, we're talking about children who are around just 12 months of age, pointing to also support the child's developing language use. They're the sort of examples we have, and I think the findings that we have from this study, while there are many, twofold in those that I want to particularly, or we want to particularly share with you this evening. And the first, I think, builds quite nicely on the findings from the study that Caroline shared with you as well. What we have here are culturally competent or culturally inclusive early language programs that acknowledge, value and reinforce the children's first languages. And I'm being quite deliberate here in the choice of the plural use of languages, because there were definitely and most often more than two languages being used by many of these children. And through valuing these, supporting the children's identity and also their learning. And the second finding, I think, has also been mentioned today, or this evening rather. What we see here is that we acknowledge the value of multilingualism as part of the children's language repertoire, and that the many English dialects known by these children, including Aboriginal Englishes and Creoles, are not seen as interference, but rather as a foundation, as part of this rich language learning that the children acquire. And they bring this to the building of standard Australian English. And we see the languages combined, building a rich repertoire and a rich resource for future learning of language, but also learning more generally. So overall, we see, just wanted to share with you now, they're the sort of the findings we have from this study, and the opportunities that this sub-study provided to perhaps just continue to celebrate the rich language learning opportunities for many children in Aboriginal communities. So thank you.
Thank you, Jane and Janet. And certainly what came out for me was this rich repertoire of languages available, and the mother's deliberate choice of languages to support children's language learning. So would we remind you to post your questions in the Q&A, and we will have a discussion and question time after the third presentation, which will be the final presentation for this evening. And we'd like to welcome Dr. Kerry Taylor-Leech and Dr. Eseta Tualaulelei. This paper is about knowing who you are, heritage, language, identity, and safe space in a bilingual kindergarten. Thank you, Kerry and Eseta.
Hello, everybody. Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting us to come on to this wonderful seminar and tell you about our project. And we're very happy to talk about our work with Pacific Islander parents and their children. These families' aspirations to their children's educational success were so strong that they were motivated to set up this project in a genuine grassroots community initiative. And they approached us through Griffith Community Partnerships Network because they wanted us to provide evidence of the kindergarten's ability to provide a safe cultural space for their children. So next slide, please, Eseta. Thank you. So the Early Years Learning Framework, which has already been referred to here, states that children have the right to be continuing users of their home language, as well as to develop competency in standard Australian English. We also know that there's a wealth of evidence that acknowledging children's diverse linguistic repertoires is important, not only for their language development, but also for building strong social and cultural identities and long-term successful learning. Yet in English-dominant Australia, there are few learning programs that nurture children's bilingual development. And while it's well established that early childhood is a critical period for first and second language acquisition, there's a lack of empirical research available on children's bilingual development in institutional early childhood education and care. Next slide, please. So we're going to tell you a bit about the Kindy project. And it was called Tualaulelei Aonga Amata, which means a good start to learning. And what we did in this project was we carried out with the, in collaboration with the parents and the community workers who initiated this project, a 7-month study of the lived experience of Samoan, primarily Samoan children, families and educators who were involved in the setting up and running of this Aonga Amata. So an Aonga Amata in this case means a bilingual Samoan English kindergarten. And although we were focusing on Samoan parents and children specifically in the Aonga Amata, we couldn't ignore its impacts on the non-Samoan children in the program. These children came from Malaysian and Indigenous Australian backgrounds. And there were also 2 Samoan educators working in the room with experience of teaching in Aonga Amata overseas. And then we also worked closely with 2 church community leaders who were instrumental in setting up this particular Aonga Amata. Now, in our research, we took a fund of knowledge approach. This is an idea which is based on validating the perspectives of the families and the communities involved, and recognizing the children as owners and creators of valuable knowledge. In our methods, in our data collecting methods, we worked hard to reflect Pacific Islander ways of knowing. So in addition to observations, participant observations, photos and video recordings, we also worked with the parents in Talanoa, which are basically talking circles. And that is how, those were our primary means of collecting data. Next slide, please. So in this, although we had other research questions, today we're going to talk about the main research question, which was really how the Aonga Amata supported heritage, language and culture. Next slide. I might actually, sorry, if you don't mind, I might could you pop back to the previous slide, etc. I wanted to add a couple of details about this Aonga Amata. It was based in an area where, because we're based in Queensland, so I probably should have mentioned, right? So this Aonga Amata was in an area where a very high number of children are classified as developmentally vulnerable. And what was happening here is that the community were responding to a cross-sector plan to reduce child vulnerability by encouraging parents in the area to enroll their children in early childhood education and care, and also to concerns in this big church congregation that Samoan children in particular were not settling or not making use of early childhood education and care, and not developing a sense of belonging in school. And so the two community leaders that I mentioned negotiated with a well-known early childhood centre to open up this bilingual program. Now, a bilingual program was preferred to a full immersion program because the centre wasn't resourced to run programs in languages other than English. And so this plus a slow enrollment led them to open up their alma mater to children from backgrounds other than English. Now, this had some implications for language learning and use, as we hope to show in this presentation. Next slide, please. So just quickly then, here I'll just put forward a couple of working definitions of children as bilingual learners and heritage language speakers. So we define bilingual learners as children who live in two languages, who have access to or need to use two or more languages at home and school. So they don't necessarily have fluency, competency, or literacy in these languages, but we're really looking at them as children who live in two languages. And we define heritage languages as languages spoken by immigrants and their children. And we follow Montreal's definition of heritage language speakers as the children of immigrants born in the host country or immigrant children who arrived in the host country at some time in their childhood. Then the steady decline of heritage language use and the lack of intergenerational language transmission and the shift to, the very rapid shift to English among Pacific Islanders in Australia and New Zealand has long been documented, along with the low self-esteem and identity insecurity that often follows the loss of heritage languages, which has also been very well documented. So we situate our study within that context. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll just start the next section and Eseta will take over from me shortly. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about what we saw about heritage language use via alma mater. But we saw throughout the room a tremendous care and effort put into displaying both Samoan and English. And language was on display. The Samoan language was on display in the form of colorful motifs and artifacts, beautiful fabrics, visuals and wall displays. The other area where there was a great deal of heritage language use was in social communication. Used mainly for social communication, a lot for emotional support, managing transitions in particular, and for scaffolding and other forms of socialization. So, for example, with greetings and goodbyes, or calling the children in from outside play to morning tea, comforting, praising, and thanking children, instructing them how to do things, directing them to activities, commenting on or correcting or censoring their behavior, talking to them about cultural events. And the educators were very instinctual about introducing someone at key points in the day, such as when they were coming in from outdoor play. And one of the educators had a lovely song she would sing to bring them in from outside. The children also heard someone from other adults, parents coming in at pick up and drop off, or from visitors to the aula, such as community leaders and other members of the Pacific Island community. So there was plenty of authentic language use in evidence. And in terms of its pedagogical use, we felt that it might have been more purposeful, in fact, but where we saw it most was in counting and alphabet games, which were done regularly when the children came together at mat time. Next slide, please, Eseta. In play, we found that we noticed that the children used almost exclusively English. Now that could be expected when not all of the children in the alma mater were Samoan, and they all spoke English as a shared language. Next slide, next shot. Eseta, the text box thing. Right. So I wanted to just put in a couple of illustrations here from our field notes. So you'll see in the top one on the left that the little boys are playing. They're not all there. There's a Chinese Malaysian boy and a couple of boys of Samoan background. They're playing with marbles and rolling them around. I'm listening really hard to see if they go into Samoan, but they don't. It's exclusively in English. But as the children settle into the daily routines and became more confident, their ability to comprehend and use Samoan increased. And they also, let me talk to you first about the slide, the text box at the bottom, where you see that the children launch immediately into saying the grace when they're sitting down to eat. We noticed that they tended to they went into Samoan when they were imitating the teacher. So they got a lot of fun out of teaching each other things that they'd learned in mat time, as you can see in that little visual. So at this point, I'll leave Eseta to carry on. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry, and good mbabigi to you all, which means welcome in the language of the Yugara people, who are the traditional custodians of the land where I'm zooming from. We're a little bit pressed for time, so I will kind of go through the next slides quite quickly, but you can read all about it in the special issue, which I do hope you check out, the special issue of TESOL in context. So we saw increased engagement with heritage language, and you'll see here in the extracts that from November we had a bit of a pear-shaped lesson that we observed, but by in October, but by November, the children had really settled down quite a bit and were enjoying the cultural activities that the educator was introducing them to. So we found that heritage language was being revived in the home, and in some cases, children were teaching their parents. And so we've got extracts here of the educators who saw the children being really confident, so confident they were teaching others. And then we have an extract from a parent who sort of regretted that she didn't know as much as her 4-year-old because she had pushed away, shunned her heritage language when she was younger. The cultural values that were promoted through the school were really important to the educators, the parents, as we found out through the talanoa, which are the talking circles. And there were quite a few benefits and constraints we found. But just to get to the conclusion, we found asymmetries between English and the heritage language, which was Samoan, in the teaching practices, resources, and student proficiencies. And this resulted in the predominance of English. And we do need to understand much more about family language practices and address how heritage language revival can be supported in the home and school and in the Australian language environment. So thank you all for listening. And as I say, the details of our article are in the TESOL in Context special issue, which we're really proud that our article is a part of. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry and Eseta. So I'd like to thank all the presenters for sharing their rich research projects with us. Although different, they all highlight practices that view multilingualism as a lived and dynamic experience. I was interested to hear about Kerry and Eseta talking about how the heritage language was revived in the home through the bilingual program. So we might move to question time now. I see a couple of questions have been already responded to. But Caroline, would you like to talk a little bit about the question, have you had any success in raising educators' awareness of unintentional invalidations? What can help educators critically reflect on this sensitive aspect of practice? This question's from Jen Jackson.
Thanks, Jen. I've replied in writing there, but I think it's a really interesting question. Have I used it with educators? I have not yet, because I'm speaking to you tonight from Hong Kong, where the approach to language learning is in fact very different from what we talk about in this article, which in and of itself has been interesting. In terms of supporting reflective practice though, one of the things that I've learned through experience is just how much reflective practice really needs support in order for the process to be productive at the end of it. And I think here, because we're talking about individuals, and individuals' practices and beliefs and ideologies are likely to differ, I think it could be helpful to talk about the article with your team and then open it up for people to be thinking about their own practice and reflecting on their own practice, and then come back together again to perhaps talk about it. But because it's personal, it may not be something that people necessarily feel comfortable with talking about, because we're pressing a few buttons here. So I think what I would suggest is use this as a provocation, and then open it up for people to, if they feel supported and safe, they may be willing to share, but it may be something that they prefer to keep personal. If it is something that you're going to be doing with your team, it could also be contributing to equip in terms of thinking about how we as a team and a service support children's linguistic diversity and encourage the use of these plurilingual pedagogies, and in that way to inform intentional teaching practice. I hope that answers the question sufficiently.
Thank you, Caroline. You can keep posting questions in the chat box. We've got a few minutes to respond to some questions. We've got a question here for the second presentation. Jane and Janet, did the focus on the strengths in the linguistic practice lead to parents doing more of these practices? That is, did it help them make them more aware of what they were doing well?
And that's a wonderful question, Jen, and great to know that you're here with us. I have typed an answer, and part of that was reflecting on the coaching practices that occur as part of the FAFT program, which is really around family educators and family liaison officers working very closely with mothers in the everyday, and really translating and highlighting the impact of what they say and do on their children's learning. So there's a really strong translation piece that occurs in daily FAFT programs. But it was a really interesting question because it did make me reflect on, and we had many discussions with co-researchers about this, how research itself can sometimes open opportunities and new platforms and vehicles for really reflecting deeply on learning, and in the context of our study, learning interactions. So I do think the fact that, the interactions were filmed and there were discussions between the family liaison officers and the mothers about what they said and did, and deep reflections around that really did provide another opportunity to really value and discuss more fully the strengths of the suite of strengths that mothers were bringing to their interactions with children. And so I think certainly when you make that more visible, it then becomes embedded in the daily FAFT program as well. So Janet, I'm not sure whether you wanted to add anything to that.
Sorry, I did a quick mute. To add to Jane's response, which I think was wonderful, what this program and the valuing of the multiple languages that the children and the mothers were using, I think just served to reinforce and strengthen that opportunity. And often, we wanted to present a very strength-based approach here, that these mothers were very capable, very able. They had rich language repertoires themselves, and those language repertoires needed and can be and were valued, celebrated and acknowledged. And I think that's the strength of this program, that the mothers saw that their own languages weren't seen as something that was not contributing to children's language, that these multiple language opportunities were exactly what the children needed, both to confirm and affirm their identities, but also as foundational to future language learning and learning more generally, as I said before. So yes, I think it was very much, Jen, focusing on the strength of the linguistic repertoires and affirming the mothers, which I think was really important as they were talking and working with their very young children.
Okay, thanks, Jane and Janet. We've got a question for Kerry and Eseta. What would you say are the most important things to have in place or to support when trying to set up a bilingual program?
Oh, Eseta, shall I start? You need resources. You need resources, and you need to perhaps be ready for the fact that your uptake might not be that quick in the first instance. And one of the problems that they had, what the community workers had in setting up this program within an existing centre, was that they needed to work within the parameters and requirements for class size and things like that in the centre, and they couldn't always sort of meet those quickly and immediately. So I think you know, there needs to be not just a sort of good feeling on the part of the host institution, but also a willingness to put in the resources and the support that is needed to get something like this off the ground. Do you want to add anything, Eseta?
Sure, Kerry. So thank you for the question. One of the issues that bilingual kindergartens or full immersion programs face across the world is actually the policy environment that they operate in. They're really quite restrictive. And so in other work that Kerry and I have done, we've argued for permissive spaces. So just some more consideration for children's heritage languages and cultures, an opening up, if you will, of some of these practices, because the Early Years Learning Framework's a beautiful document. It's very inviting and it's very promising, but that promise will be difficult to reach if we don't put in structures and strategies and empowering type of initiatives like those that produce resources like that Kerry mentioned. So yeah, we're facing that. And the Aonga Amata it has been done in New Zealand before, and it's actually been done in all the Pacific languages in New Zealand quite successfully, including the Indigenous language there. So I can only imagine the power that such a bilingual kindergarten could produce in Australia with the many languages that need to be maintained and revived here. So yeah, I think policy is something that we've argued quite strongly for. Thank you.
Thanks, Kerry and Eseta. And I think that emphasis on policy is really important. We've got a question here, which I think is really important. And as Yvette, I think maybe you'd like to speak to this a little bit more. How can we actively encourage children to draw on their home languages in the preschool classroom or the early childhood setting more generally if we don't speak the home language?
And I think this speaks to all of the questions that have been asked tonight, is that we need to think of any early child setting as a language ecology. We talk about Brofenbrenner's ecological, model of ecological development, and language is key and central to that and aligns very directly with that. Need to make space for and make visible all the linguistic and cultural resources that children bring. Make script visible, have bilingual books, have parents come in and do bilingual book reading. Draw out children's languages through every action of the day, through greetings as they happen, through actions when children, are playing with items they're playing with. There are lots of ways to draw out their language, and also to acknowledge and indicate that you understand what they're communicating when they're not speaking English, and you're not forcing them to say, oh, this is it in English. Having a conversation and that turn taking when it's not just in English, and encouraging it, and that validates and gives space for children's languages. So I think at the heart of it, you need to start thinking of any setting as a language ecology, and that you want to make that visible and pay respect to all of the languages there.
Thanks, Yvette. And we might just finish off with this question from Ingrid for Janet and Jane about do you plan to conduct quantitative analysis of the data The comment is, it would be interesting to explore associations between mother's gaze and talk and the child's gaze and talk.
Thank you, Ingrid. I'm sorry, I was just writing a response to you, but we'll speak. We have published a range of articles from this study, so if you're interested in reading some of the other articles, we can certainly send you the details of those research articles. But I might hand over to Janet, because Janet, as part of the research study, did work very closely with a PhD student who did explore the data and analyse the data in a lot more detail. So Janet, I might ask you to speak to that a bit more fully.
Thank you, Jane. We haven't done an extensive quantitative analysis. We could do, because we do have the Studio Code, and I don't know whether you're familiar with Studio Code, but Studio Code is a sort of a real-time analysis of video, which then you put the particular codes in, such as gaze, touch, language. So we do have that data there to do some further analysis with, in terms of the Excel spreadsheets that are then produced from the analysis, to have a look at sort of how they might work in terms of sort of total numbers. But what's most interesting when we start looking at the Studio Code is perhaps the qualitative analysis, because we are looking at the sort of the contingency responses. When you lose that, when you just sort of have a spreadsheet of numbers in front of you. So our analysis to date has really looked at how gaze was followed by language, how touch was followed by language, how touch and gaze work together. And you actually see that from the timelines, rather than from a more sort of extraction of that data into sort of quantitative tables. So it is possible, but at the moment our analysis really looked at the contingency around touch, gaze and language, rather than separating them out into sort of quantifiable tables that separate the interactions. Because I think when you start thinking about language, you think about it holistically in terms of how those three, or the patterns work together. So yes, it is possible to start thinking about it in sort of a quantitative measures, but at the moment the contingencies are really what we were looking at in terms of how they supported the young children's language learning.
Okay, thanks Jane and Janet. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank the presenters for sharing their work with us this evening in this important and dynamic space. And as Kerry and Eseta mentioned, it's about growing strong social and cultural identities through these rich language repertoires. And I think what we haven't spoken about so much tonight is partnerships that have been formed between educators, researchers, and families and communities. I'd also like to thank the editorial team for their hard work on bringing the special issue to fruition. Yvette Slaughter, who's with us on the panel, Jill Pennington and Gary Bonner, who we hope are in the audience and are also was part of that group. We'd like to say a special thank you to Carly Minette for her work as TESOL in Context Coordinator. She's been with us for a few years, and this will be her last edition, and we welcome Skye Playstead, who will be taking on the role of Coordinator of TESOL in Context in the next month or so. We'd appreciate your feedback. It's really important to us. Please complete the survey for this event. The link is in the chat, but will also be emailed out shortly, along with the link to the recording of this evening's session. To view the TESOL in Context edition launched, please see the link in the chat. And to view upcoming professional development for various states and territories, please look at ACTA's website under the News and Events tab. A recording of this evening's presentation will be found on the Vic TESOL website in the Early Childhood Education series web pages. Please see link in the chat box. And we're really excited, after 2 years of postponement, The ACTA 2022 conference will be held in Brisbane, September 26th to 28th, and it's all about pushing boundaries. And I think that's what we've been on about tonight as well. So for more information on this, it's also available on the website, and the link is in the chat box. And we really hope to see you in Brisbane in September. If you're interested in becoming a member of your state and territory association, and we do highly recommend this, you can find contact details on the ACTA website. A second presentation for the Big TESOL Early Childhood Education series will be held on August the 18th. The project is about learning languages and play, and it's an Australian intergenerational family study. And it will be presented by myself, Yvette Slaughter, Professor Susie Garvis from Swinburne, and Professor Lucas Walsh. So thank you once again for being part of this launch of the special edition of this early childhood edition of TESOL in Context, and we hope to see you at future events.